Meet the African queen who humiliated Rome's legions, not in a metaphorical way, not with clever words or secret alliances. No, she literally went to war with the Roman Empire and made them retreat. Her name was Queen Amanirenas, a warrior, a mother, a monarch who ruled over the powerful Kingdom of Kush, a civilization just as ancient and mighty as Egypt itself. She led armies, she wielded spears, she lost one eye in battle, and when the world's most ruthless empire came knocking on her door, she didn't run or surrender, she fought. And what's more, she won. But chances are you've never heard of her, because history didn't want you to. History wanted you to believe that African queens were weak, passive, exotic footnotes in the margins of empire. That resistance only came from the edges of civilization, that Rome was untouchable. But Amanirenas destroyed all of that with one fearless decision. So tonight we dig deep. Past the sand, past the silence, past the ruins, we tell the story that's been erased for 2,000 years. This is the forgotten tale of the one-eyed queen who brought Rome to its knees. Let's begin. In the heart of ancient Africa, south of the Egyptian deserts and north of the equator, lay a kingdom built from black stone and blazing sun, Kush. If you've never heard of it, that's not your fault. Kush was one of the most advanced civilizations in ancient history, rivaling Egypt in architecture, religion, and military power. They built pyramids, they forged iron weapons, they created a writing system. They worshipped gods that would later blend with Egyptian deities, and they traded gold, ivory, and incense with powers across the known world. At its peak, Kush wasn't just strong, it was a powerhouse. Its capital, Meroe, was a city of fire and trade. The streets rang with the sounds of smelting furnaces and markets bursting with color, silks, spices, and stone sculptures. And unlike most ancient kingdoms, Kush wasn't ruled solely by men. This was a place where queens reigned as equals, sometimes as co-rulers, sometimes alone, sometimes even above the kings. They were called Kandakis, warrior queens, and among them Amanirenas was a legend. But before she took the throne, the world around her was changing. To the north, Egypt, once a mighty civilization in its own right, had fallen under the grip of a new superpower, Rome. It was 30 BCE. Cleopatra had died. Julius Caesar was gone, and a new emperor had risen, Augustus. He was ruthless, calculating, and hungry for expansion. Rome didn't just conquer land. It swallowed cultures, enslaved populations, and redrew maps with iron and fire. Now Augustus set his eyes on Nubia, the land of Kush. The Romans wanted more than trade. They wanted dominance. And Queen Amanirenas wasn't going to let that happen. At the time of her reign, Amanirenas ruled alongside her husband, King Teretekes, and their young son. She wasn't a ceremonial figure. She was a warrior queen, deeply involved in the politics and the battlefield. When her husband died, Amanirenas became the sole ruler, and her kingdom sat at a critical crossroads. Rome had recently conquered Egypt. The border between Kush and Roman-controlled land had shifted. The Kushites wanted their independence. The Romans wanted tribute. And so, like with so many empires before, tension began to rise. In 25 BCE, Rome's governor of Egypt, Gaius Petronius, marched south. He captured several Nubian towns. He tried to flex Roman muscle across the desert frontier, but he underestimated who he was dealing with. Because Amanirenas wasn't just going to defend her borders, she was going to launch a counterattack. And what followed was legendary. In 24 BCE, Amanirenas led her army north across the Nile into Roman-controlled Egypt. Yes, you heard that right. She didn't just defend. She invaded Rome's newly acquired territory. Her warriors weren't a ragtag resistance. They were trained fighters, archers, cavalry, foot soldiers armed with iron-tipped spears and massive shields made from animal hide. And she didn't come to negotiate. She came to send a message. In a series of lightning raids, Amanirenas captured Roman garrisons and border towns. Her forces stormed the city of Syene, modern-day Aswan, and took it. They even took Roman prisoners and marched them back to Kush. But it gets better. At one Roman outpost, her army seized a bronze statue of Augustus Caesar, the emperor of Rome himself. And when they returned to Kush, they did something incredible with it. They buried the head of the statue beneath the steps of a temple. Why? So that every time a Kushite entered to worship, they would walk on the face of the Roman emperor. That's not just a victory, that's a statement. That is resistance carved into stone. But Rome wasn't going to stay quiet. Gaius Petronius, furious at the invasion, launched a counterattack. He pushed south with thousands of troops, burned Nubian towns, took hostages, tried to re-establish control. But Amanirenas wasn't done. She pulled her forces back strategically. She didn't waste her army in a drawn-out war on open terrain. She knew how to use the land. Desert warfare wasn't Rome's strength. They were built for organized battles on familiar roads, not hit-and-run raids in burning heat with archers ambushing from rocks and camouflaged positions. Amanirenas used this to her advantage. She launched guerrilla attacks. She sabotaged Roman supply lines. She made every Roman step into Kush feel like a mistake. And then, when the timing was right, she negotiated. But not from a place of weakness. From a place of power. She sent envoys to meet the Romans. And what came next shocked even Augustus. A treaty. Rome agreed to withdraw from its southernmost conquests. No tribute would be demanded from Kush. And the land that Petronius had tried to annex returned to the Kushites. It was one of the only times in Roman history when a foreign power resisted, fought back, and walked away with a treaty on their terms. And Queen Amanirenas made it happen. This treaty held for decades. Rome never tried to conquer Kush again, because they had learned this queen was no ordinary ruler. She wasn't a puppet. She wasn't a placeholder. She was power. But if that's true, why don't we learn about her? Why isn't her name mentioned alongside Cleopatra, Boudica, or Joan of Arc? Because the world wasn't built to remember queens like Amanirenas. It was built to erase them. She was a black queen from sub-Saharan Africa who led armies and outsmarted Rome. She didn't fit the narrative of barbarian resistance or exotic queen in distress. She flipped the story and history, especially the kind written in Latin scrolls and dusty European libraries, didn't know what to do with that. So they buried her story, just like they buried her statue. But they couldn't erase the ruins of Meroe, or the pyramids of Kush, or the oral traditions passed down in whispers. And now, centuries later, archaeologists are finally piecing it back together. The head of Augustus that Amanirenas buried, it was rediscovered in 1910 by a British archaeologist, still underground, still under temple steps. And when it was pulled out of the earth, it wasn't broken or ruined. It was perfectly preserved, as if Amanirenas wanted us to remember, as if she left us a clue, a reminder that even the greatest empire in history once bowed its head to a queen from the African desert. When Rome left the battlefield, it did something it almost never did. It went quiet. No statues were erected to celebrate their campaign in Kush. No epic poems. No triumphal marches through the streets of Rome. Because deep down even they knew they hadn't won. Augustus, the emperor whose face Amanirenas buried in the dirt, never even mentioned her name in his official records. He just said vaguely that ambassadors came from a nation of Nubians. That's all. That's how scared they were of the truth. Because what Amanirenas had done wasn't just military resistance. It was psychological warfare. She didn't need to conquer Rome. She only needed to show the world that it could be defied. And for that, Rome would never forgive her. But they could never forget her either. Because Amanirenas had done the unthinkable. She beat them at their own game. But to understand why she was able to do this, why this queen stood so far above the others, you need to understand the kingdom she came from. Kush wasn't like Rome. It didn't expand by forcing other cultures to submit. It didn't erase gods or crush languages. It grew by adapting, by learning, by blending old and new. Kush was a fusion of African, Egyptian, and unique local traditions. And its power wasn't just built on steel. It was built on something far more rare in the ancient world. Balance. Balance between men and women, between ruler and people, between spiritual life and daily struggle. In the temples of Meroe, you could find inscriptions showing queens seated beside kings, not behind them, not beneath them, but equal, sometimes even towering over them. Kushite queens could own land, lead armies, pass laws, and rule without a husband, and they were trained in warfare from a young age. That was the world Amanirenas came from, a world where no one flinched when a woman stood on the battlefield, spear in hand, shouting orders, where the line between queen and general was not just blurred, it was non-existent. And Amanirenas in particular was feared not just because she was brave, but because she was relentless. The Roman writers, even in their denial, called her a masculine woman, blind in one eye. But they didn't mean masculine as an insult. They meant powerful, intimidating, warlike. They couldn't understand a woman who fought like a man, so they tried to describe her in terms they could comprehend. But Amanirenas wasn't imitating Roman men. She was living in accordance with Kushite strength. She didn't need Roman approval. She didn't ask for a crown from Caesar. She took her place in history with blood and fire. And the land she ruled, vast, fertile, and rich in gold, was far from a forgotten corner of Africa. Kush sat on one of the most important trade routes in the ancient world. Everything passed through her kingdom. Ivory, ebony, incense, iron, even exotic animals. Greek merchants came through. Egyptian traders did too. Even Indian and Arabian spices made their way along the Red Sea into Meroe's bustling markets. The capital city was no provincial town. It was a hub of technology and culture. Its people wrote in Meroitic script, one of the oldest written languages in Africa. They carved stories into temple walls. They built pyramids, yes, real ones, steep and narrow, far smaller than Egypt's but more numerous. And they buried their dead with reverence. Kushites weren't living in the shadows of other empires. They were building something entirely their own. And Amanirenas stood at the center of it all. After the war, she returned to Meroe, not as a hero who'd gotten lucky, but as a legend who had rewritten the rules. She had outlasted Rome. She had protected her people. And most importantly, she had left them with something few rulers ever do. Pride. Pride in their culture, in their language, in their gods, in their queens. Because for all the soldiers she may have led, Amanirenas' greatest weapon was belief. She made her people believe they could stand up to the greatest power the world had ever known. And that belief didn't fade. Long after she died, her name continued in Kushite chants and desert memory. Her tomb, though never found, is believed to lie among the pyramids of Meroe, still standing in silence after more than 2,000 years. Tourists pass by them today without even realizing the stories buried beneath their feet. But if you look closely, you can still see the faces carved in stone, the spears, the eyes, the queens. And in the shadows of those pyramids, the wind still whispers of a time when one woman rose from the heat of the desert, faced down an empire, and won. And that's not just history. That's legacy. That's the part they couldn't destroy. Not with swords. Not with silence. Not even with time. The Romans never invaded Kush again. Not in Augustus' lifetime. Not in the lifetime of his successors. They didn't even dare. And that silence, that deliberate absence, is the story. Rome went on to conquer massive territories in Europe and the Middle East. They marched through forests, deserts, rivers. They faced down Celts and Germans, Persians and Parthians. But they never turned back toward the south. Because something had shifted. Kush wasn't just another frontier anymore. It had become a warning. And Amanirenas was the reason why. Her name didn't show up in Roman triumphs, but she showed up in their nightmares. Even in defeat, Rome could spin a story to preserve its pride. But this? How do you spin the story of an African queen who burned your temples, decapitated your emperor's statue, and forced you into a peace deal you didn't want? You don't. You pretend it didn't happen. You call her an unnamed female ruler. You let her fade from your records and hope history forgets. But it didn't. Not in Kush. Because while Roman historians were trying to erase her, the people she ruled were building monuments to her memory. They told her story through song, through sculpture, through the way queens ruled after her, with heads held high and spears always close. Even centuries later, when the Kingdom of Kush eventually declined, its pride didn't. You can still feel it in the ruins of Meroe, in the stone lions that guard the temples, in the pyramids that rise from the red sand, each one sharper and more defiant than the last. And that's the real power of Amanirenas. She didn't just win a war. She shifted the energy of an entire civilization. She turned Kush into something greater than a kingdom. She made it unforgettable. Even as centuries passed and new empires rose, the legend of the warrior queen with one eye never truly died. It drifted through oral traditions, resurfaced in Ethiopian chronicles, even echoed across the Red Sea into Arabia. And something else happened too, quietly beneath the surface. A kind of reverberation. Because once the world saw what a queen like Amanirenas could do, the idea never went away. You see her spirit later in Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, who fought off Portuguese colonizers for decades. You see it in Ya Asantewa of the Ashanti, who led her people into battle against the British Empire. And in modern times, you see it every time a black woman refuses to be small, to be silent, to be dismissed. That defiance, that refusal, that's Amanirenas. Not a ghost, not a statue, a signal. She was never just a queen of ancient Nubia. She became a symbol of something much larger. Resistance, dignity, unshakable pride. The Romans had no idea what they were awakening when they sent troops into Kush. They thought they were marching into a desert campaign. They didn't know they were walking into a legacy. And when that legacy pushed them back, they didn't just lose a battle. They lost the illusion of invincibility. That matters, because the Roman Empire built itself on the belief that no one could stop them. But someone did. And not with legions or wealth, with will. With loyalty, with fire, and with one eye still fixed on the future. Because the truth is, We don't even know exactly what Amanirenas looked like. No Roman artist ever painted her. No Kushite statue survived with her name carved into the base. But we know her silhouette. We know her strength. We know her power. And sometimes that's all history needs to survive. Not an image, not a date, not even a grave. Just a story that burns hot enough to light the path ahead. That's what Amanirenas left behind. Not just in Meroe, not just in Nubia, but in every place where people decide they will not bow. Not to emperors, not to colonizers, not to the heavy weight of empire. Because if Rome could be stopped, what else could be possible? The Kingdom of Kush didn't vanish overnight. It took centuries, but like a fire burning low under desert wind, it dimmed, slowly, quietly. And that silence was its downfall. Not defeat, not disaster, just the slow erosion of memory. After Amanirenas, Kush would never be the same again. The war with Rome had shaken everything: economy, politics, trade routes. Even though Amanirenas had won, she had to rule a kingdom that was now more cautious, more watchful, still proud, still sovereign, but always looking over its shoulder. And to the north, Rome watched too. They honored the peace treaty for a while. They stopped raiding. They let Kush breathe. But trade between the two grew strained. The old routes that had made Meroe rich, full of ivory, iron, and incense, began to shift. Rome started dealing more with Red Sea ports. Arabian merchants, Greek traders, and new seafaring empires gradually pulled commerce away from the Nile. And with the trade went the lifeblood of Kush. Meroe's iron industry, once the envy of the region, began to fade. The great temples were still tended. The pyramids still rose against the desert sky. But something was changing. Bit by bit, Kush was being isolated, cut off, not by swords but by forgetting. By the 4th century CE, the kingdom that had once defied Rome was slowly breaking apart. Internal tensions grew. Local leaders fought for power. Religious shifts swept through the region. And then the silence deepened. The Aksumite Empire, rising from the highlands of modern Ethiopia, invaded from the southeast. They burned Meroe. They ended the dynasty, and with that, the last breath of ancient Kush vanished into the sand. No more queens, no more pyramids, no more chants in the Meroitic tongue. The desert buried what was left, but the world did something worse. It looked away. For centuries, the memory of Kush, its kings, its queens, its battles, its triumphs, was erased from global history. Even as European explorers wandered through Sudan, finding broken temples and strange pyramids, they didn't know what they were looking at. They thought they'd found southern Egypt. They had no idea they were standing in the ruins of a once mighty African empire, one that had outlasted pharaohs, one that had faced down Rome, one that had been ruled in its strongest moment by a woman with one eye and an iron will. They didn't know because no one told them, because history isn't just about what happens. It's about who controls the memory. And for far too long, that memory was in the wrong hands. When 19th century archaeologists finally uncovered the pyramids of Meroe, they didn't celebrate African excellence. They dismissed it. They called it primitive imitation. They said Kush was just a shadow of Egypt. But Kush was not Egypt. It was its own power, its own rhythm, its own empire. And if Amanirenas had been born in Europe, she'd have schools named after her, movies made about her, gold coins minted in her image. But she was born in Africa, so instead she was forgotten, pushed to the edge of history. Until now, because history doesn't stay buried forever. Not when it's this powerful. Not when it belongs to queens who refuse to kneel. And the truth is, we are still catching up to what Amanirenas meant, not just for Kush, but for the entire global south, for every nation, tribe, and people who've ever been told they were footnotes in someone else's story. She showed us that there's no such thing as a minor character when you're the one holding the sword, or the pen, or the crown. For almost 2,000 years, the name Amanirenas was spoken only in whispers, if at all. The West didn't teach her story. The textbooks skipped over Kush entirely. In their pages, Africa had no queens, no empires, no victories over Rome. Only deserts. Only silence. But silence doesn't last forever. And stories like Amanirenas, they don't die. They wait. And when the time is right, they rise. In the late 1800s, as European explorers combed the Nile in search of ancient secrets, they stumbled upon something they couldn't explain. Dozens of pyramids, not Egyptian ones, smaller, sharper, clustered tightly together. Meroe, the lost capital of Kush. They found temples half swallowed by sand, stone lions guarding doorways, chambers filled with inscriptions in a script no one could read, the language of a forgotten people. And slowly, very slowly, the questions began to form. Who were these builders? Who were these kings? Who were these queens? And then came the fragments. Roman texts, Greek records. One line stood out like thunder. A female ruler who led her army against Augustus himself. That was her, Amanirenas, the warrior queen who burned Roman outposts and forced an empire to compromise. At first, scholars didn't know what to make of her. She didn't fit their image. She wasn't Roman, she wasn't Greek, she wasn't European. She was black. She was African. And she had won. So they called her obscure. They claimed her victory was exaggerated. They buried her again, this time under doubt. But the world was changing, and so was the way people saw history. African scholars began to take back the narrative. They studied the ruins of Kush, the writings of ancient chroniclers, the stories passed down through generations. They saw Amanirenas not as an outlier, but as a symbol, a centerpiece of African resistance, a defiant leader who proved that black women had always held power, not just in myths but in reality. Her name began to resurface in books, lectures, and classrooms. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But something had begun. In Sudan, she was hailed as a national hero. In Pan-African circles, her story was shared like a battle cry. In diaspora communities, she became a face for reclaiming stolen heritage. Artists painted her fierce, one-eyed, unbroken. Writers invoked her in poetry and protest. And still, the details of her life remain elusive. No one knows what she looked like. No one knows where she's buried. But her spirit? It's everywhere. In every resistance movement that refuses to bow. In every girl who grows up believing her skin, her gender, her origin don't make her less. They make her dangerous. They make her royal, because Amanirenas didn't just lead a kingdom. She rewrote what leadership looked like. No throne behind palace walls. No rule through inherited privilege. She earned her crown on horseback, with blood on her spear and a nation at her back. She saw Rome coming, and she stood her ground, even when her eye was lost, even when her cities were burned, even when Augustus, drunk with power, sent message after message demanding submission. She answered not with parchment, but with fire. And now, centuries later, the world is finally catching up to her courage. Because we don't need perfect records to recognize power. We don't need statues to honor queens. All we need is truth, and her truth cuts through the lies like a blade through silk. Amanirenas may have ruled thousands of years ago, but her spirit, it never left. Not the land, not the people, not the fight. In modern-day Sudan, her name echoes in murals, in protests, in songs. She is not a forgotten relic. She is resistance personified. And if you ask the people who still live where Kush once stood, along the banks of the Nile, beneath the shadow of Meroe's pyramids, they'll tell you, she never surrendered, and neither have they. In a country shaped by colonialism, civil wars, dictatorship, and revolution, Amanirenas is more than a memory. She's a blueprint. Her refusal to kneel to Rome is mirrored in today's refusal to be ruled by oppression. When Sudanese women led the front lines of the 2019 revolution, demanding freedom, justice, and civilian rule, observers were shocked. But history wasn't, because it had seen this before. In a queen who stared down the greatest empire on earth and told it, no. That same fire burns today in every woman who leads, organizes, fights, or dares to speak truth in the face of violence. They are Amanirenas reborn, not in crown and chariot, but in voice and vision, in conviction, in courage. The legacy of the Kandake, the warrior queens of Kush, is not sealed in tombs, it's alive. Passed through blood, preserved in culture, rewritten in every girl who grows up hearing not just of Cleopatra and Joan of Arc, but of Amanirenas. And this isn't just a Sudanese story, it's an African story. It's a global story, because for too long black women have been written out of the narrative, told they were side characters, footnotes, silenced. But Amanirenas didn't wait for permission to speak. She took the stage, with a scar over one eye and her enemies in retreat. She showed the world something it still struggles to accept. That power does not belong to empires. It belongs to those who rise, who protect their people, who refuse to be erased. In schools across Africa, students are just beginning to learn her name. In Pan-African movements, she is hailed alongside Nefertiti, Nzinga, Ya Asantewa, and Makeda. In feminist circles, she stands tall among the foremothers of resistance, and as her story spreads, she becomes something greater than a queen. She becomes a mirror, a reminder that greatness isn't given. It's taken. It's earned in the dust and heat of defiance. It's carved into history, not by those who conquered the most, but by those who refuse to be conquered. The irony is painful. The world remembers Augustus. They build statues in his name. Museums honor his conquests. But Amanirenas, she burned his ambitions to ash, and history blinked and looked away, but not anymore. Today we tell her story because it matters, because memory is resistance, because to speak her name is to crack the walls of historical silence, to let truth pour through. And the truth is this: Africa didn't wait for colonialism to give it kings and queens. It had them long before, and many of them were women. Commanders, diplomats, strategists, rulers, and Amanirenas, scarred, sovereign, undefeated, is the proof. Picture this. A Roman soldier stumbles into the ruins of a sacked garrison. The walls are black with smoke. Arrows still jut from bodies cooling in the dust. And the golden eagle of Rome lies broken in the dirt. Not taken, not stolen, shattered. That was Amanirenas' message. It wasn't enough to defeat Rome on the battlefield. She wanted them to feel it, to see it, to know they had been humbled by a queen they thought beneath them. And so Somewhere around 24 BCE, in the chaos of retreating Roman forces, her warriors found something strange. A statue, a bronze bust, the head of Augustus Caesar himself, divine son of Julius, self-proclaimed restorer of the Roman world. It had been commissioned to project power, glory, dominance, and now it was in her hands. A trophy, a message, a weapon. But Amanirenas didn't melt it down. She didn't sell it. She didn't even keep it in her palace. She buried it. Not in the ground, but beneath the steps of a temple in Meroe, face down, so that every time her people came to worship, they would walk over the head of Caesar, not by accident, by design. She turned the Emperor of Rome into a literal footrest. His image, once meant to be revered, was now trodden on by farmers, mothers, priests, and children. That was her brilliance, because Amanirenas understood something empires never do. You don't need to destroy your enemy. You just have to humiliate them, to make them small, to make their gods, their statues, their symbols, yours. And when archaeologists uncovered that buried head in 1910, still intact, its expression untouched, calm, idealized, arrogant, it became a time capsule, not of Roman glory, but of Kushite defiance. Today that bronze head sits in the British Museum. Its label reads, Head of Augustus from Meroe. But what it should say is, this is what it looks like when an empire loses, because no Roman general could erase what Amanirenas did. She took their emperor and made him dirt beneath her people's feet. She understood the psychology of conquest, not just swords and chariots, symbols. Rome tried to project dominance through marble, bronze, and propaganda. She answered with silence and sand, with a statue buried and forgotten, until history was ready to remember it again. And now it stares at millions of museum-goers every year, detached from its body, removed from its purpose, and surrounded by whispers of the queen who put it there. No plaque can change that. No museum wall can dull the message, because Amanirenas didn't just defeat Rome. She mocked it. She rewrote what victory looked like, not with legions, but with footsteps, thousands of them, marching across Augustus' face every day for years. That's not just history. That's art. That's power. And that's why Amanirenas wasn't just a queen. She was a strategist of the mind, a master of meaning, a legend carved in fire and silence, the one-eyed queen who didn't need to rule the world, just needed the world to know it couldn't rule her. So what do we really remember? A scarred woman, a burning city, a broken statue, a buried emperor. That's all that remains of Amanirenas in the pages of most history books. A few lines, a footnote. But in the echoes of the Nile, in the dust of Nubian pyramids, in the fire behind the eyes of a new generation, she is so much more, because Amanirenas didn't just fight. She didn't just win. She disrupted the narrative of history itself. In a world where African queens are often romanticized, exoticized, or simply forgotten, Amanirenas refused to fit the mold. She didn't charm her enemies. She crushed them. She didn't beg for peace. She forced it. She didn't ask to be remembered. She made it impossible to forget her, even when history tried. And now, 2,000 years later, her story rises again stronger than before, because the world is changing. We're asking different questions. Who gets to be a hero? Whose victories matter? Why are some names shouted through time, while others are buried beneath it? In Amanirenas we find an answer, an anchor, a roar beneath the silence. She proves that history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's rewritten by those who endured. And while Rome may have lasted longer, built taller, conquered more, Amanirenas left behind something they never could. A moment of undeniable resistance. A victory unshaken by time. A story too raw to be polished, too powerful to be silenced. And maybe that's why her legacy hits so hard today. Because we're still battling the same erasures. The same erasures of black women's power, of African complexity, of stories that challenge the empire's version of events. But Amanirenas doesn't just belong to Sudan or to Africa. She belongs to everyone who's ever faced a giant and said, "You will not take this from me." Everyone who's ever watched history ignore them and still made their mark anyway. Everyone who walks forward, even with one eye gone because the other still sees freedom on the horizon. Her name deserves to be spoken not with pity or nostalgia, but with awe. With pride, with purpose, because this isn't a bedtime story. This isn't mythology. This is fact. This is Queen Amanirenas, the warrior, the strategist, the fire that made an empire back down, the one-eyed queen who stood when the world expected her to fall. So the next time you hear about Rome and its glory, remember the scarred queen who sent them home in pieces, the queen whose silence buried a Caesar, the queen who turned an emperor's head into a doormat. Remember that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks quietly over the face of conquest and keeps walking.